Fashion in the Middle Ages was far more than a collection of garments stitched together with thread and hope. It was a visual language, a code that proclaimed status, power, religious devotion, and, in many cases, the sheer will to survive in a world where cold, mud, and social hierarchies were as unforgiving as a knight in a jousting tournament. From the coarse, patched tunics of peasants that fell apart with wear to the jewel-encrusted brocades of kings, heavy as armor, medieval clothing reflected a deeply stratified society obsessed with symbols and often willing to sacrifice comfort for appearance. In an era where life could end from a fever, a sword, or a particularly harsh winter, fashion not only shielded against the elements but also defined who you were, whom you served, and whether you could afford more than a sack dyed with berry juice. Let's unravel the medieval wardrobe, from the dark days after the fall of Rome to the twilight of the medieval period, with an informative tone and an occasional wink, because even in a world of castles, crusades, and imaginary dragons, fashion had an absurd side that raised an eyebrow, like when someone decided a shoe with a half-meter-long toe was the height of elegance. Let's start with the early Middle Ages, 5th to 10th centuries, a period of chaos and reinvention following the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. Europe was a mosaic of barbarian kingdoms: Franks, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Anglo-Saxons, Lombards, isolated monasteries, and muddy roads that seemed designed to swallow the feet of anyone daring to traverse them. Fashion in this era was practical, almost Spartan, reflecting a world where survival was the priority and luxury was a rarity reserved for kings, bishops, and lords who could afford to import silks from Constantinople. The Germanic tribes, which dominated much of Europe, abandoned the elegant drapery of Roman togas in favor of functional garments designed for war, fieldwork, and winters that made even the bravest shiver. The star garment for both men and women was the tunic, known as tunica in Latin, kirtle in Germanic languages, or gown in Anglo-Saxon contexts. These tunics were long, straight, with wide or fitted sleeves and round or V-shaped necklines, stitched with rudimentary seams that often unraveled under the weight of daily life, especially if you lived in a village where mud was more common than bread. Wool, thick, durable, and often carrying the lingering scent of sheep, was the undisputed queen of fabrics. It wasn't exactly soft. Imagine slipping into a sweater that itches like a field of nettles and calling it fashion. Raw, undyed wool was the choice of peasants, while finer, carded, and carefully woven versions were reserved for nobles. Linen, lighter and softer, was used for inner tunics, known as chemisia or chemise, which served as underwear and protected the skin from the scratchy outer wool. However, linen was a luxury, as its production required stripping the flax plant stem in a long, tedious process that drove up its cost. Colors were muted: browns, grays, moss greens, beiges, because natural dyes were expensive and hard to produce. Blue came from woad, a plant that required days of fermentation in conditions that smelled worse than a stable. Red came from madder or, in rare cases, imported cochineal, and yellow came from plants like saffron, turmeric, or dandelion, which were more common in southern Europe. Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, rarely saw colors beyond the natural hues of undyed wool, which gained a rustic charm after months of use, though also an aroma that didn't invite hugs. Men paired these tunics with trousers or hose, fitted garments that covered the legs and were tied with cords, leather straps, or even strips of cloth. Hose, made of wool, linen, or, in rare cases, leather, were practical for riding horses, working in the fields, or fleeing a Viking raid, but they must have been a nightmare to put on, especially if wet from rain or sweat. Some men used strips of cloth wrapped around their legs, known as winingas among the Anglo-Saxons, a precursor to modern stockings that provided some warmth but unraveled easily in mud. Women wore a lighter linen undertunic, covered by a thicker woolen one, with sleeves that could be wide for summer or fitted for winter. Hems were often reinforced with double stitching to withstand wear, but even so, a tunic could turn into a rag after a year of heavy use. Over these tunics, both men and women wore rectangular cloaks, known as sagum among the Franks, pallium in Roman contexts, or brat in Celtic lands. These cloaks were fastened with metal, bone, or wooden brooches that were both functional and decorative. Peasants used simple brooches carved from wood or forged from iron, while nobles sported bronze, silver, or even gold brooches encrusted with stones like garnet, amber, or colored glass, which glimmered like small beacons in a world of shadow. Footwear in the early Middle Ages was a challenge in itself. Shoes, if they can be called that, were hand-stitched leather pieces, often without hard soles, more akin to rigid socks than modern boots. Known as turn shoes because they were sewn inside out and then turned right side out, they were surprisingly durable but offered little protection against rocky paths or freezing winters. The wealthy could afford soft leather boots, sometimes decorated with simple embroidery, buckles, or laces, but peasants often went barefoot in summer or wore rudimentary sandals made from raw leather strips tied with knots. In winter, everyone wrapped their feet in strips of cloth or leather, a system that worked until mud or snow turned it into an icy slush that left toes purple. Socks, as we know them, didn't exist. Instead, strips of wool or linen were wrapped around the feet, a tedious process that likely made many prefer the cold to the hassle of wrapping and unwrapping. Hoods, integrated into cloaks or sewn as separate garments, were more common than hats, offering protection from rain, wind, and prying eyes. Women, especially married ones, covered their hair with veils or headscarves, a practice dictated by the church, which deemed loose hair a sign of immodesty, though in practice, many peasant women ignored this rule while milking cows, grinding grain, or chasing an escaped pig. Accessories were essential, even in this early period. Belts, made of leather or woven fabric, not only held tunics in place but also served as makeshift wallets, with pouches, knives, tools, or amulets hanging from them. These pouches, known as scranum among the Anglo-Saxons, could be simple leather or, for nobles, embroidered fabric. Brooches, like the annular ones of the Anglo-Saxons or the decorated discs of the Visigoths, were a canvas for creativity, engraved with geometric patterns, animals, or Christian symbols like crosses or fish. Peasants used simple versions carved from wood or bone, while nobles wore bronze, silver, or gold brooches set with semi-precious stones like garnet, amber, or quartz, which caught the light in the dim halls of castles. Jewelry was rare among peasants, but nobles wore rings, bracelets, and necklaces of metal, amber, or pearls, often with amulets blending Christian and pagan beliefs, like crosses with runes or solar symbols. Noble women used cloth or metal headbands to secure their veils, sometimes adorned with embroidery or small gems, while men wore buckles or brooches engraved with animal motifs, crosses, or Celtic knots, reflecting the cultural heritage of the Germanic tribes. Byzantine influence was notable among the elites, especially in the Frankish and Visigothic kingdoms, which maintained trade and diplomatic ties with Constantinople. Kings like Charlemagne imported Byzantine silks, decorated with gold threads and motifs of crosses, lions, peacocks, or stylized trees, worn during ceremonies to impress their subjects. These silks, lightweight yet warm, were a luxury that contrasted with the coarse wool of peasants, and wearing them was a way of saying, "I'm important, and my clothes prove it." Charlemagne, according to his biographer Einhard, preferred Frankish simplicity with wool tunics and short cloaks, but even he succumbed to the allure of Byzantine silks for coronations or banquets, pairing them with gold crowns and jeweled brooches. Clergy also adopted Byzantine elements, with liturgical tunics and cloaks in symbolic colors: white for purity, red for martyrdom, green for hope, embroidered with silver threads that made masses look like sacred fashion shows. These vestments, often donated by nobles as offerings to the church, could cost as much as a warhorse, a reminder that even religion had a price in the Middle Ages. Clothing production was an arduous process involving the entire community. Women, from peasants to nobles, spent hours spinning wool or linen with wooden spindles, weaving on rudimentary looms that took up half a room, and sewing with bone or iron needles. Spinning was so ubiquitous that women carried spindles hanging from their belts, twirling them while walking or tending children. Looms, made of wood and rope, produced fabric just a few centimeters wide, meaning a tunic could take days to complete. Dyers, often specialized men, worked in foul-smelling workshops, mixing plants, minerals, and even insects to create lasting colors, though never lasting enough. Woad blue required soaking fabric in a fermented broth that smelled like a forgotten swamp, while cochineal red was so costly only nobles could afford it. Clothes were rarely washed, as clean water was scarce, and soap, made from ash and animal fat, was a luxury. Instead, garments were aired, brushed, or scented with herbs like lavender or rosemary, which explains why medieval castles weren't exactly an olfactory paradise. As we move into the High Middle Ages, 11th to 13th centuries, fashion grew more complex, reflecting a more stable Europe with the rise of feudal kingdoms, crusades, and trade. Society was rigidly hierarchical, and clothing became an even clearer marker of status, like a neon sign shouting, "I'm a noble," or "I'm just a peasant, leave me alone." Tunics remained the wardrobe's foundation but became more elaborate, with longer, wider sleeves, sometimes lined with furs like ermine, fox, rabbit, or even marten for the wealthiest nobles. Women wore two-layered dresses, a fine linen undertunic, or chemise, which doubled as underwear and protected the skin, and an outer tunic, known as a blyout in France and Normandy, which could be cinched at the waist with a belt or laces. The blyout was distinctive, with flared sleeves that cascaded to the wrists or even the floor, proclaiming, "I don't work with my hands because I don't need to." Some blyouts had sleeves so long they were knotted to avoid dragging on the ground, a gesture blending practicality with ostentation, as if to say, "Look how much fabric I can afford to waste." Men also adopted longer tunics, often with embroidered hems in colored threads or, in rare cases, gold or silver. These embroideries, featuring geometric patterns, crosses, or animals, were meticulous work done by women in castles or specialized artisans in towns. Cloaks, known as mantellum or cloak, became more elaborate, with semicircular or circular shapes, fastened with jeweled brooches or metal chains. These cloaks could be wool for lower-ranking knights, silk for nobles, or even velvet, a fabric starting to appear in the richest courts. Crusaders, returning from the Holy Land, brought influences from the Islamic world, such as tunics with geometric patterns, floral embroidery, or vibrant colors like scarlet, deep blue, or emerald green. These influences blended with European styles, creating richer, more diverse fashion, especially in the courts of Sicily, Al-Andalus, and southern France, where contact with the Arab world was constant through trade and crusades. Luxury fabrics made a difference in the High Middle Ages. Silk, imported from Byzantium or through trade routes with Al-Andalus and the eastern Mediterranean, became more common among the nobility, though still prohibitively expensive. A single silk tunic could cost as much as a horse, and only kings, dukes, and bishops could afford to line their cloaks with it. Linen, now more refined thanks to improved looms, was used for undertunics, while wool, woven in patterns like herringbone or twill, was the choice for outer garments. Colors grew bolder. Red, from cochineal or kermes, an insect producing scarlet dye, symbolized wealth and power. Blue, from imported indigo, was associated with nobility and the Virgin Mary, and green, from plants like parsley, was popular in northern European courts. Black, though less common, began appearing among the wealthy, achieved with dyes from oak bark or walnut, a process that took days and left dyers' hands looking like they'd fought a squid. However, dyes weren't stable. A red dress could fade to pale pink after a couple of washes, if it was washed at all, since cleaning remained a luxury for the rich with access to clean water and servants to scrub. Sumptuary laws, regulating who could wear what, became stricter in the High Middle Ages, reflecting society's obsession with maintaining hierarchies. In England, France, and the Iberian kingdoms, only nobles could wear colors like purple, associated with royalty since Roman times, or fabrics like silk or velvet. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council imposed rules on the clothing of Jews and Muslims, requiring them to wear distinctive markers like yellow hats, patches, or colored cloaks, a grim reminder of how fashion could also be a tool of exclusion and social control. Peasants, stuck at the bottom of the feudal pyramid, continued wearing short, undyed wool tunics, coarse cloaks that smelled of the stable, and raw leather shoes, often patched with scraps that seemed to shout, "I still work, barely." Peasant women wore simple headscarves or coifs, often undyed linen, tied under the chin to keep hair out of the way while working in the fields, kitchen, or loom. Men wore wool hoods or straw hats, which protected from sun and rain but fell apart after a couple of seasons. Footwear evolved slightly in the High Middle Ages, especially among nobles. Pointed shoes, known as polanes or krakows, began to appear, with toes extending several centimeters beyond the feet. These shoes, made of soft leather or fabric, were a status symbol, utterly useless for manual labor or walking muddy paths. Some nobles decorated them with embroidery, buckles, or small bells, a detail that must have driven their servants mad in a quiet castle, where every step jingled like a tambourine. Noble women wore leather or fabric slippers, often embroidered with colored threads, pearls, or bits of glass, more decorative than functional, designed for display in castle halls, not for chasing a runaway cart. Men, especially knights, wore short leather boots for riding, with iron or bronze spurs that not only controlled the horse but also showed off at tournaments, where the clinking of spurs was part of the spectacle. Accessories were a crucial part of medieval fashion, even among the lower classes. Belts, now more elaborate, could be embossed leather or woven fabric, with bronze or iron buckles decorated with enamels or engravings. Noble women wore long veils, secured with metal or embroidered fabric headbands, sometimes so complex they required a maid to adjust them properly. Some veils were embroidered with gold or silver threads, a luxury that made women look like angels in churches or queens at banquets. Men wore hoods or felt hats, sometimes adorned with feathers, brooches, or ribbons, adding a touch of theatricality to their appearance. Jewelry, from iron rings to amber, pearl, or colored glass necklaces, was a luxury for the wealthy, though peasants wore simple amulets of wood, bone, or carved stone, often with religious symbols like crosses or saints, believed to protect against disease, demons, or the evil eye. Crusaders adopted elements from the Arab world, like turbans or silk scarves, worn under helmets to shield from the desert sun, which, upon returning to Europe, became a status symbol, as if to say, "I've been to the Holy Land and lived to tell the tale." The Church's influence was omnipresent in medieval fashion. Clergy wore long tunics and liturgical cloaks, often of fine wool or silk, decorated with embroideries depicting biblical stories, like the life of Christ, apostles, or martyrs. Liturgical colors, white for purity, red for martyrdom, green for hope, purple for penitence, had specific meanings, and bishops and cardinals wore cloaks and mitres so elaborate they rivaled noble attire. These vestments, often donated by nobles as offerings to the church, could cost as much as a suit of armor, a reminder that religion was also a business in the Middle Ages. However, the church also enforced modesty rules, especially for women, requiring veils and long tunics covering from neck to ankles. This didn't stop noble women from pushing boundaries. V-necklines, open sleeves revealing the undertunic, and waist-cinching belts were ways to hint at wealth without fully defying the rules. Men, meanwhile, wore shorter tunics to show off fitted hose, a nod to vanity that often sparked fiery sermons from pulpits, where priests warned against the arrogance of the flesh. By the late Middle Ages, 14th to 15th centuries, fashion leaped toward extravagance, especially among the upper classes, fueled by a European economy boosted by trade, the rise of cities, and the growing bourgeoisie. Luxury fabrics like velvet, brocade, and damask silk became more accessible, at least for the wealthy, and women's dresses transformed into true works of art. Bodices, cinched at the waist with laces or seams, paired with skirts that fell in heavy folds, often with trains that swept the floor like a textile entourage. The huppeland, a long, voluminous tunic with wide sleeves, became an iconic garment for both men and women. These garments, lined with furs like ermine, marten, fox, or even lynx, were so heavy that moving in them required practice, as if wearing a tailored tent. Sleeves could be so long they brushed the floor or were cut into petal-like shapes, a detail called dagging, which added drama but also collected dust, dirt, and castle crumbs. Some huppelands had sleeves so wide they doubled as makeshift pockets, where women stored handkerchiefs, jewelry, or even small prayer books. Men embraced bolder styles, reflecting the growing influence of courtly fashion. Tunics shortened, revealing hose that were now tighter and, in some cases, two-toned, with one leg red and the other black, a style that must have turned heads in the courts of France, England, and Burgundy. These hose, hand-sewn from wool, linen, or silk, were so snug that putting them on must have tested patience, especially after a medieval feast of beer, bread, and lamb stew. To keep them up, hose were tied to a short jacket, known as a doublet, which cinched the waist and buttoned at the front. Doublets, often padded to give a sturdier torso, were the medieval equivalent of a tailored suit, decorated with embroidery, metal buttons, pearls, or even gems. Some men wore doublets with detachable sleeves, which could be swapped for different occasions, a practical trick that transformed a work outfit into one fit for a gala without a full change. Cloaks remained essential but could now be shorter, known as tabards or surcoats, decorated with coats of arms, heraldic motifs, or embroideries depicting battles, lineages, or courtly love. Tabards, worn at banquets and tournaments, were a way to proclaim status, like wearing your family tree stitched on your back. Noble cloaks were lined with furs and embroidered with gold or silver threads, while those of lesser knights were of fine wool, often dyed in vibrant colors like red or blue. The bourgeoisie, enriched by trade in wool, wine, and spices, adopted these fashions to mimic nobles, sparking the ire of sumptuary laws that tried to restrict luxury fabrics to the nobility. In England, for instance, a 1363 law banned merchants from wearing velvet or silk, but the wealthy bourgeoisie, with overflowing coffers, found ways to skirt these rules, like sewing discreet embroideries that looked humble but cost a fortune. Footwear reached new heights of extravagance in the late Middle Ages. Polanes grew absurdly long, especially in the courts of France, England, and Burgundy, with toes stretching up to half a meter. Some were stuffed with horsehair, moss, or straw to hold their shape, and the most extravagant were tied to the knee with metal chains to avoid tripping, proving that medieval fashion already understood the art of suffering for style. Sumptuary laws tried to curb this trend, setting maximum toe lengths based on social rank. Nobles could wear longer toes than the bourgeoisie, and peasants couldn't wear them at all, but the wealthy always found ways to flout them, adding bells, embroidery, or curved toes that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. Noble women wore fine-pointed slippers of velvet, embroidered leather, or silk, more decorative than functional, designed for castle halls, not muddy paths or straw-strewn stone floors. Luxury fabrics defined the late Middle Ages. Velvet, soft, shiny, and heavy, was a noble favorite, especially in Burgundy and Italy, where it was woven with silk threads for an almost supernatural sheen. Brocade, woven with gold or silver threads in floral, animal, or geometric patterns, was so expensive that a single dress could cost as much as an entire village, cows included. Damask silk, imported from Italy, Sicily, or the Islamic world, was used for dresses, cloaks, linings, and even veils, its lightness contrasting with the heft of wool or velvet. Dyes also evolved. Black, from oak bark, walnut, or iron, became popular among the rich, though achieving a deep black was a costly process that left workshops smelling like swamps. Scarlet red, from cochineal imported from the Americas toward the end of the medieval period, was another prestigious color, used in the courts of Burgundy, France, and England to flaunt wealth and power. Blue, from imported indigo, was a northern court favorite, while green, from plants like parsley or lichen, was common in rural regions. Fashion in the late Middle Ages reflected the opulence of courts, especially in Burgundy, one of Europe's cultural hubs. Nobles wore houppelans with sleeves so long they swept the floor, embroidered with tales of chivalry, religion, or courtly love, as if each garment were an illuminated manuscript. Women donned increasingly extravagant headgear, like the hennin, a conical hat that could rise a meter high, draped with gauzy or silk veils that floated like clouds. Popular in France, Burgundy, and the Low Countries, these hats were so unwieldy they required a juggler's balance, and passing through a low doorway must have been a nightmare that left ladies with stiff necks. Some hennins had two combs, known as horned headdresses, giving women a mythical creature vibe, though the church criticized them as the devil's work. Women also wore hairnets, known as crisping pins or cauls, decorated with pearls, gold threads, or small charms, which kept hairstyles in place and added a touch of sparkle. Men didn't lag in extravagance. Padded doublets, giving a broader torso and wider shoulders, were popular among knights, paired with two-toned hose, one leg one color, the other another, that must have amused court jesters. Some wore short cloaks, known as tabards or surcoats, decorated with coats of arms, heraldic motifs, or Latin phrases, used at banquets and tournaments. Armor, though not clothing in the strict sense, was also a form of fashion. Parade armor, adorned with engravings, gilding, enamels, or even gem inlays, made knights look like living statues, used in ceremonies, tournaments, and processions to dazzle crowds. Helmets, with visors carved as animals, human faces, or dragons, added theatricality, as if war were also a fashion show. Accessories were a universe unto themselves. Belts, now more elaborate, could be embossed leather, embroidered fabric, or even metal chains, with bronze, silver, or gold buckles decorated with enamels, gems, or engravings. Noble women wore chains hanging from the waist, with keys, reliquaries, small mirrors, or ceremonial daggers, not only decorative but also symbols of their authority as castle ladies or household managers. Men carried leather or fabric pouches, known as aumônières, hanging from the belt to hold coins, keys, amulets, or a chunk of bread for the road. Jewelry, from gold necklaces to rings with rubies, sapphires, or emeralds, was a power symbol, and noble women wore bracelets and earrings so heavy they caused headaches or reddened ears. Peasants, meanwhile, wore simple amulets, wooden crosses, carved stones, or tin reliquaries, believed to protect against disease, demons, or the evil eye. Religion remained a strong influence in the late Middle Ages. The Church enforced modesty, but nobles, especially women, found ways to push back. Square necklines, revealing the upper chest, and open sleeves showing silk or linen under tunics were ways to flaunt wealth without fully crossing into heresy. Clergy wore liturgical vestments of silk, fine wool, or velvet, embroidered with biblical scenes like the life of Christ, apostles, martyrs, or the apocalypse. Liturgical colors, white, red, green, purple, black, had specific meanings, and bishops and cardinals wore cloaks, mitres, and croziers so elaborate they rivaled royal attire. In Gothic cathedrals like Chartres or Notre Dame, religious ceremonies were also fashion parades, with clergy in embroidered cloaks weighing more than a child, glowing under stained glass light. Peasant fashion, however, remained functional, barely touched by courtly extravagance. Short wool tunics, coarse cloaks, and raw leather shoes hadn't changed much since the early Middle Ages. Women wore simple headscarves or coifs, often undyed linen, tied under the chin to keep hair out of the way while working in fields, kitchens, or looms. Men wore wool hoods or straw hats, shielding from sun and rain but falling apart after a few hard seasons. Clothes were patched repeatedly, with scraps often sturdier than the original garment. Colors, if any, came from homemade dyes like berry juice, beetroot, or tree bark, yielding muted reds, browns, or greens. At village festivals, colors bloomed, with women sporting berry-dyed headscarves and men wearing belts with elaborate knots or hand-carved bone brooches, a small rebellion against the monotony of rural life. Medieval fashion was also shaped by climate and geography. In Northern Europe, where winters were brutal, thick wool cloaks, wolf, bear, or rabbit furs, and lined tunics were essential to avoid freezing in drafty castles. In the south, like Italy, Sicily, Al-Andalus, or Aragon, lighter fabrics like linen, cotton, and silk were more common, with styles reflecting Islamic influence. Flowing tunics, vibrant colors, and geometric embroidery inspired by Arab art. The Crusades and trade with the Islamic world brought not only fabrics but also embroidery, dyeing, and weaving techniques that enriched European fashion. Markets in cities like Venice, Genoa, Bruges, Toledo, and Barcelona were hubs of exchange, where merchants sold Chinese silks, Egyptian cottons, Flemish wools, Italian velvets, and spices like saffron, used for both cooking and dyeing fabrics in bright yellows or oranges. Clothing production was a laborious communal effort, from villages to courts. Women, from peasants to nobles, spent hours spinning wool or linen with wooden spindles, weaving on looms that took up half a room, and sewing with bone, iron, or, rarely, bronze needles. Spinning was so pervasive that women carried spindles on their belts, twirling them while walking, tending children, or watching livestock. Looms, made of wood and rope, produced narrow fabric strips, meaning a tunic could take days or weeks to complete. Dyers, often specialized men in damp, foul-smelling workshops, mixed plants, minerals, insects, and even urine to create lasting colors, though never lasting enough. Woad blue required soaking fabric in a fermented broth that smelled like a forgotten swamp. while cochineal red was so costly a single dress could rival a stone house. Tailors, starting to form guilds in cities, cut fabrics with rudimentary shears and sewed with linen, hemp, or, in courts, silk threads, creating garments that could last years, though not without patches and patience. Fashion was also a social battlefield, especially in the late Middle Ages, as the bourgeoisie, enriched by trade in wool, spices, wine, and metals, challenged traditional hierarchies. Sumptuary laws multiplied in cities like Florence, London, and Paris, trying to control who could wear what, but the wealthy bourgeoisie bought velvet, silk, and brocade to mimic nobles, infuriating the elites. In the Burgundian court, one of Europe's richest and most sophisticated, banquets were impromptu fashion shows, with nobles in houppelans so elaborate they looked like theater costumes. Women wore gravity-defying headdresses with veils floating like banners and hairnets sparkling like jewels, while men flaunted fitted hose, padded doublets, and short cloaks embroidered with tales of tournaments, battles, or romances. Fashion was a spectacle, but also a weapon, a way to assert power in a world where status was everything. Medieval fashion wasn't static. It evolved with the centuries, reflecting changes in economy, technology, religion, politics, and culture. In the early Middle Ages, simplicity ruled, with tunics and cloaks designed for survival in an uncertain world of invasions and chaos. In the High Middle Ages, trade, crusades, and feudal kingdoms brought new fabrics, colors, and styles, making fashion a status marker in a hierarchy-obsessed society. In the late Middle Ages, extravagance peaked, with garments more art than clothing. From polaines defying logic to hennons reaching for the sky, from padded doublets giving men epic hero torsos to dresses with trains sweeping castle floors. Yet behind every dress, cloak, pair of hose, and headdress was a story of labor, creativity, and sacrifice. Women spun and sewed at home, dyers mixed colors in damp workshops, tailors cut fabrics with surgical precision, and nobles spent fortunes to look like kings, though sometimes they only looked like medieval jesters. Medieval fashion also had its absurd side, and you don't have to look far to find it. Polaines could trip their wearer on a step, tall headdresses snagged in doorways, heavy cloaks were mud magnets, and tight hose must have been torture after a day on horseback or a 3-hour feast. Women's long tunics tangled in furniture, embroideries frayed with wear, and gauzy veils tore in the slightest breeze. But these inconveniences were part of the charm. Dressing in the Middle Ages was an act of will, a way to tell the world who you were, even if that world was just a castle of gossipy nobles, a monastery of preaching monks, or a village of nosy neighbors. From the patched, coarse tunics of peasants to the gold-threaded brocades of kings, glowing under torchlight, medieval fashion was a tapestry of stories, woven with threads of faith, power, ambition, creativity, and a touch of vanity. And while we laugh today at pointed shoes, impossible sleeves, towering headdresses, and hose that left little to the imagination, we must admit that medieval fashion, with all its flaws, was a masterpiece of its time. Complex, fascinating, and contradictory as the Gothic cathedrals, illuminated manuscripts, and knightly sagas that defined the era.